want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflex here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. For today's video, I'll be making a pseudo-tier list, but instead of talking about why each craft deserves to be in the tier it is, I'll be explaining why these crafts might have ended up where they are. So I think the distinction might not make sense, but instead of talking about each specific deck, I'm going to talk about the similarities these decks share and how that shapes them to where they are in the current metagame. Obviously, a patch just hit, and the patch was very, very minor, and since no nerfs happened, and none of the buffs were really strong enough to make these decks really that powerful, we're looking at the exact same meta from last set, or from last patch in last month. So, whatever you saw in previous videos is going to be exactly the same as this final month of this set. So, if you want to change, then there's not too much going on unless you're a Puppet enjoyer, in which case Puppet is notably better. Notably better meaning that it's gone from absolutely unplayable to having some pretty notable strengths. But we'll talk about why it's not as good as some other decks that are in the meta, probably. Obviously the deck's still in flux, so it might deserve to be in this tier 2 slot instead of tier 3. I'm just making this video now to talk about why these 4 decks are so hard to, dethrone in the current meta, and the reason why these buffs didn't do nearly enough to make Dragon or Portal obviously tier 1. So I guess we might as well just go bottom up just for the sake of making the video a bit more, I guess, like make it more escalating, if that makes sense. So why are Portal and why are Dragon at tier 3? So Dragon, in the decks I have that are very notable power cards, Dragon has 2 current styles of gameplay. One is going to be the Jerry and Cositis cheese one-shot kill, where you play Fenny, and then you dig through your deck until you find Jerry and Cositis at a discounted rate, and then you play Jerry, evolve Jerry, play Cositis, and then play a tablet to reduce your card count to 4, and of course when you end your turn, you win the game instantly by drawing the victory card. The reason why this particular deck can never be better than tier 2 is because when the goal is very slow compared to what things like Rune and what things like Roach do. So this is an example of a deck having a somewhat consistent or achievable win con. Like you can add in different win cons into that deck to make it not such a one-trick pony. But for the most part, this win con, unless you super high roll, will always be slower and less consistent than the decks above it that want to do similar things. Now, the Storm version is technically a bit more consistent, but the reason why it's also a tier 3 concept is mainly because you do rely on your opponent not drawing answers in time for your cards. So instead of being a deck that can outright win no matter what when you draw the curve, instead it's a deck that kind of relies on your opponent not being lucky enough to hit the counter cards. So this deck relies on stuff like Galmu, Forte, Garyu, Genesis Dragon. These are all cards that are quite good at hitting your face really, really hard. Garyu, for example, is probably the highest win rate card for Dragon if it's played on curve, especially twice in a row. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Garyu, his win rate, if he's played on curve, is like something ridiculous, like 65%. And then, like, Storm Dragon's win rate is entirely supported by Garyu being played on curve. But that's kind of an example, that's a good example of what we'll talk about later on. So, Storm Dragon is just a deck that requires you to, well, not really requires you to draw well, but you are consistently going to be drawing into this like very either tempo heavy line where you have Seasoned Merman and you have Neptune for a bunch of minions to response check one way, and then you have all the Storm minions that response check the other way, where something like Forte, for example, requires your opponent to have either targeted spell damage or like ability destruction effects, or an AoE that can kill her past 4 or 5 HP depending on whether she was normal evoed or super evoed. So again, Dragon as a deck is, it has win cons. Obviously, it's not very good, but even with the buff to Liu Fang to make their ramp a bit safer and double ramp a bit more consistent around turn 5 or 4 or 5, depending on how hard you ramped earlier, it's still not good enough because it lacks the consistency needed to perform. It lacks the faster win con needed to perform, or rather, the Jerry Cositis combo is fast enough to win, but you have to like ramp twice. You have to ramp like twice or 3 times, play Fenny on curve, draw once, and then get the combo immediately in order to outspeed something like Rune for the most part. So going on to Portal, it's basically the exact same story as current Storm Dragon. You're going to be playing a bunch of really solid tempo slash value plays. So like Electric Puppeteer, obviously known as probably the best 2-drop in the game due to the puppet being really high value. Puppet Lancer is going to be a similar story where the enhanced puppet is slightly more expensive, but because as a puppet player you don't have many great 3-drops, like you have Yudi, you have the other puppet Bane card, but for the most part your turn 3 is kind of empty, so you're fine with playing enhanced puppet for more tempo. And then usually you lead that up with great value cards again, like Zwei, who was buffed in this recent patch, so she's actually a lot more valuable when it comes to board clear and board control. Stuff like Noah, who can buff your puppets for the future Liam and Orcus turns, but obviously Noah himself is very good at controlling the board without evoing, or you can evo him if you value the puppets in your hand more than you value the free evo from Noah, if that makes sense. And then obviously you have Odin, who I forgot to conclude in here, but you have the classic Odin, Orcus, Liam, which are just very strong burn cards. So very much like Storm Dragon, if you were to draw the perfect curve for Puppet, you now have a lot of essentially storm damage from Orcus because she gives allied puppet followers storm, so they all go face, and when you evo her, she gets 2 enhanced puppets. So obviously with herself and Lloyd attacking herself into a minion and Lloyd into your face, she deals 8 damage. And then Liam summons 3 enhanced puppets, and then with an evo makes them all deal 2 on death rattle. So with his super evo you can deal 7 damage without support of extra puppets. So obviously if you were to play a 4th puppet with Liam, he now deals 9 instead of 7, or 8 instead of 6 rather, from the other side. And now the major addition to this combo that was added with this new patch is Puppet Cat. Puppet Cat is now a 1 mana 1/1 rush that can now clear itself to allow you to play a puppet on the board. So when you play it and there's a super evolved follower on the field, you now get a 4/1 puppet, and surprise surprise, being a 1 mana card, you can now have 12 damage reach with Orcus and Puppet Cat. And that is essentially their version of Albert. And we all know how scary Albert is on turn 9, turn 10. Orcus is doing very, very similar stuff. Obviously, it's a 2-card combo instead of 1-card combo, so it is a bit more conditional for Puppet, but it doesn't change the fact that Puppet now has equal reach to something like Sword, which again is very massive reach. So again, much like Sword, if you take or if you lose early tempo against something like Puppet and they deal some scratch damage, you can find yourself dying very quickly. And then again, as Puppet, you can play stuff like Odin to storm your opponent down. So something that as ridiculous as like Odin into Orcus 1 into Orcus 2 with Puppet Cat, that can be super hard to stop because your opponent might not have enough healing, because usually healing is the only way you're going to be able to get out of those certain reaches. So these are the tier 3 decks. These are decks that have a very obvious win condition, and if it all works out, even then they still might not win because the higher tier decks either have a response to it or are slightly faster at the win. And this is mostly true just for tier 1 decks. Tier 2 decks are ironically somewhat weaker to these tier 3 decks, but because of the fact that these tier 2 decks rather have a bit more consistency, that's the reason why in my opinion they're 1 tier above these tier 3 decks. So starting with Forest, this is going to be your generic Roach Forest. And you'll notice that there's a lot of cards missing here, and that's because the only card you really care about in this deck is going to be Roach. And we all know what Roach does. Roach is the OTK, the classic OTK. They build a bunch of 0 costs from Cairn, maybe they have some Veils, and then they ram your face in for 20 or more damage on turn 8, 9, or 10, depending on how lucky they were, and then you lose. Now, a major thing you might notice with Roach is that they only have 1 real healing card, and that's going to be Gilnelis. You can play stuff like Olivia, but Olivia only heals 2 mana for basically like you're going to play Olivia only when you want to super evo her. So you can treat Olivia as like a 7 mana heal 2 and Gilnelis as a 3 mana heal 5 or even more if you choose to Cairn for some reason. So obviously with Roach, their OTK combo is very, very consistent. The only way they really brick their OTK combo is if they never draw Roach in the first like 30 cards, or if you play Odin and they don't have a second Godwood Staff, or they didn't draw the second Roach in their hand. So this deck is obviously very notorious because it cycles very easily. It does all these things that makes their combo pretty inevitable if they draw well, but they don't have healing. So their their stance in the tier list is automatically dropped to tier 2 because against stuff like Storm Dragon, against stuff like Puppet, against stuff like Sword and other things, what ends up happening is that you have to spend too many resources staying alive, and then instead of being able to commit to your game plan of just one-shotting somebody, you instead have to play the game of keeping out of your opponent's lethal range by spending the valuable resources you would otherwise use on one-shotting them. And because playing a combo deck, you know that you'll never reach the one-shot timing because you can only kill someone from 20 HP from like turns 8, 9, 10. And obviously these storm decks like Dragon, Storm has some healing, but it's not consistent because you need Neptune. Puppet has no healing, so you could technically outrace Puppet by getting tempo from them if they somehow low roll, and then doing a Roach combo for slightly lower amounts because they didn't manage to heal out. But as we go deeper into the tier list, or once we start talking about tier 1, you can see how the ability to kill people from a lower amount of HP threshold is really irrelevant because of how ridiculous the healing can get as we go into these upper tiers. Now in tier 2, also, we have Midrange Abyss. So Midrange Abyss is going to be very similar to Storm Dragon, very similar to Puppet Portal, where they're essentially playing very high quality cards and just beating your face in with these high quality cards and trying to finish you out with a Storm. Now, the reason why Abyss is in a notably higher place is mainly because of Cerberus. So if you know how Neptune works, obviously Neptune is Dragon's basically strongest source of healing. Cerberus is a way better card than Neptune because she does both. You can choose between doing burn or healing, and her one-time healing is more than Neptune, and she also can put out way more damage than Neptune can because Neptune obviously can't go face with the Orcas. So Cerberus can either deal 7 damage by cloning the Mimi follower that she generates, or you can heal 6 HP from cloning the Coco follower. And obviously Super Evo pings 1 to face, so that's the reason why Mimi would be doing 7 overall if you were to clone Mimi. And that's a really big deal because Cerberus is, first of all, a bigger body. She can leave more minions on the field, and she just has way more pressure because she also has a fanfare that gives you more damage, which is obviously something, again, that Neptune lacks. So obviously Neptune is 7 mana and Cerberus is 8 mana, so she is slightly more expensive, so that's why she gets more effects. But it is just more on the idea that this card, which performs a very similar role as Neptune, just has way more added to her because she is just a straight up better card. And for Midrange Abyss, you are still playing stuff that have really good value, like Argavi, one of the best value cards on turn 5. Undead Soldier, who is basically the second most difficult minion to clear, with Norman topping him by a good amount, but still being obviously very sticky because most people can't clear it. You have stuff like Congregate of Entwining, who is essentially a power crept portal card, and obviously has a lot more value in mode, but still has insane value if you play them on curve on Midrange Abyss. And then you have stuff like R&V, who I forgot to put in here, but stuff like Rulnai and Valneric, again, very, very powerful on curve play. Like 15 mana, or 7 mana 15/15 is way above curve in almost every single way, and so Midrange Abyss, while not having the mode value in the later game, can play these on curve, and mode is not getting this value on curve to begin with. So if you're playing this on turn 7, right when it's supposed to be played, you are getting the full value out of it on that curve. So again, tier 2, because the idea is very similar to the tier 3 decks, except they do it a little bit better because they get access to way better statted minions while still maintaining a very similar burn profile and damage profile. And so now we get into tier 1. What makes every deck in this meta, or what makes every one of these decks tier 1 in this current game? They all share a lot of healing, they all share fat minions, and they all share a one-shot potential or extremely high burst potential. And fourth, they also have a lot of win cons. And so let's start with the hottest take of all, well, not really the hottest take, but let me start with the most disputable of all 4 categories existing at the same time, and that's gonna be Sword. So you might have noticed that when I started listing that off, I very specifically mentioned a lot of healing. Now, I know Sword players love to complain about how much healing Rune and Haven have, but do Sword players realize how much healing they have in their decks? So obviously some Sword decks cut down to 2 layers, and I don't think any of them cut down to like 2 Congregate Usurpations, but let's just pretend for the sake of argument that you are playing a deck with all 3 copies of Lair of Usurpation, Devotee of Usurpation, and Congregate of Usurpation, and maybe 1 or 2 Ravening Tentacles. Now, if you remember, all 3 of these cards have access to Gilded Goblet. Gilded Goblet is a 1 mana heal 2, which is actually very above rate for healing in this game. The only thing that out heals or outvalues Gilded Goblet for its mana cost is Benison, which is crazy if you think about it. There are very few cards that heal you 2 HP per 1 mana point. The closest thing being Spell-Light or Sage-Light Teachings is heal 4 for 3 mana, so obviously it's entire mana more expensive than what Gilded Goblet could give for the same value. And now you might say, okay, you want to be fusing these Gilded Goblets into something like Sincero anyways, but for the most part, you're never going to fuse more than 2 Gilded Goblets overall. You go to fuse 1 if you draw Sincero, and then you rarely get to play the second Sincero because you want to save it for Albert, or you're going to play like a 2-3 damage Sincero instead. So that means that Sword has access to at least 7 Goblets. That is 14 HP. Let that sink in. Sword in an average game can heal up to 14 HP if they choose to drink most of their goblets except for 2. That is 18 HP if they drink all 9 goblets, which can happen if you never draw Sincero. And with Ravening Tentacles, that is another 5 HP. And so these Sword players that complain so much about Haven, so much about Rune having ridiculous healing, it turns out their healing is not even that far behind, especially if compared to something like Rune, which is kind of ironic, again, considering that how often you see Sword players complaining. And the only reason why I noticed that personally is because at the start of the expansion, as I was playing Roach, I would try and set up 2-turn kills versus these Loot Sword players, and they would very consistently heal out of my 2-turn kill range. And that's because, once again, they have literally the most efficient healing in the game outside of Haven, which is, again, really crazy. And then going down the list, obviously Sword has insanely high value minions. Congregate of Usurpation and Zirconia are just 2 minions that do everything you need to do as a Sword player. Either you draw a Congregate and therefore you can clear the board for free and therefore save Evos unless you really need to use an Evo to clear the board. And if you're using Evo and Congregate of Usurpation, odds are you're clearing a very wide board, which is kind of crazy because that usually means that you're clearing like 7-8 mana worth of minions with just Congregate Usurpation Evo, who cheats out 1 mana. So let that sink in for a moment. And then Zirconia, notorious, don't really need to talk about her. And then something like Sincero even, against decks that run not much like direct board clear, like they don't have like things that deal 9 damage easily, like let's say something like Storm, something like Puppet without Bane. Sincero is an 8-9. That is beefy, that's huge. If you don't have a super Evo minion that can cleanly clear this, that is like potentially just losing by itself, even if Sincero himself doesn't deal that much damage for some reason. Like they evoed him with only 2 loot cards fused, but then you can't kill Sincero himself because, again, 8-9 for 6 mana, ridiculous. That's not even including the fact that you don't need Sincero to set up kills. A very, not necessarily classic, but a very, I guess that is classic. Like one of the ways that Sword could set up lethals, even in set 1, even in set 2, was by playing Vowels, having him ambushed into Albert. And obviously, if you play Vowels and you have the, the confidence to evo him, he becomes a 6-5 ambush. And so you might realize that if you play him on turn 8, 6-5 ambush, you set up a 19 damage combined burst with Albert. And obviously, this is super telegraphed. Everybody's going to try and clear that Vowels, everyone's going to try and ward up to minions that are above 4 HP or 3 or more HP to like prevent Albert. But that is another win con that is not dependent on you having Sincero, blasted. That's not a win con that is dependent on you killing your opponent, like chipping them down for Odin spam. Like that is simply a win con that you can ego check your opponent on, and that's only a 2-card combo. And getting 1 damage, especially in this iteration of Loot Sword, is really, really easy. So you have the classic, going down win cons, you have the classic, Sincero burst with Ostrich with her spell, Remnant of Hollowness, like turn 7, deal 12 into whatever burn you have, usually kills people. You have Zirconia just winning the game outright on turn 4, 5, 6. If you play her and your opponent can't clear them, you have Val's Albert just doing 1 billion damage if Val's manages to stay on board. And you even just have Albert himself just playing him twice in a row and people can't heal out of it. And then the final win con is the value win con, where you just heal like you're playing at something like Storm or Puppet or Midrange Abyss, where your goal isn't even necessarily to kill them outright because they will also run out of resources. So you just play super efficiently and you heal out of their desperate lethal attempts because once again, you have up to 28 healing in your deck as a sword player who isn't even known to be healing while playing very aggressive tempo. So this is literally the same vibe you'll get with every single one of these decks. Rune probably really doesn't need that much introduction. Rune is also a deck that has crazy healing, it has crazy statted minions, it has multiple win cons, and it even has like an OTK that is one of the fastest in the game. The only OTK that is faster consistently than Rune OTK is literally Roach. Think about that. I mean, you don't even think about that. You already know. Everyone knows what Crusaders Climb or Kuan Climb does, right? And so similarly to the sword, you have a bunch of healing through Sagelight, a bunch of healing through Norman, a bunch of healing through Gilneas, right? 3 cards that are massive healing. You have fat minions like Angrea, like Kuan, like Norman Golems. Demonic Call adds the OTK for Kuan. Also, you can play Demonic Call as a free, literally free 3/3 rush, which helps you control the board and gives you tempo. So once again, multiple win cons. You can even win with raw tempo from Rune in case you're playing as a slower deck because you have so many 2/2s. Angrea is really strong on tempo. Obviously, Norman Golems kind of just sit there and are fat and are literally like Norman is by far the hardest card to remove in the game. Like it's not even close on curve. Wilbert defeated by Odin. What defeats Norman cleanly? Basically, just I think that one. I think Supplicant of Unkilling might be the sole card besides Cup that can clear the board and maintain tempo against Norman, which is, again, absolutely crazy. And obviously, Norman also has healing, which, again, Rune is notorious for healing. But just to, like, really stick on this, again, Sagelight, you have 3 Sagelights, so that's 12 HP. You have 3 Normans, usually. That's 24 HP. So Rune can heal up to 36 HP. Once again, Loot Sword can heal up to 28. That's only 8 less HP. Although I guess Gilneas now exists, so obviously, if you're evoing Gilneas, you can't evo Norman, but if you were to use 3 evos on Norman and then the last one on Gilneas, that would be another 4 HP. Or I can say super evo, so another 5 HP probably. So Rune is healing up to 37 HP if you used every evo on healing. So maybe that is a bit better than Sword, but you guys get what I mean. So yeah, not really much, I guess, like exposition needed for Rune on why it's very similar and why it deserves tier 1 because, again, fastest OTK, has great tempo, can kill you earlier, and just has a bunch of healing to stay alive and very great value minions. Now, Cresthaven is my personal pet peeve, mainly because I don't understand why Marwyn is a 4/4 for 4. But once again, let's just go through the list, right? Massive healing. Yeah, Venison. Oh, also, just in case, I feel like not many people will complain about this or like realize this about Haven, but have we noticed that if you get full value from some kind of repos, it is literally a Sagelight Teachings? Like, this is a 3 mana heal 4 over 4 turns, and odds are the Crest Haven is living all 4 turns. So some kind of repos, the crest it gives you, not only advances your win con because you're going to be playing Marwyn, not only helps you proc Benison, it's also giving you incredibly efficient healing because, again, heals Sagelight. If you use Marwyn's spell, it heals more, and the body it gives is kind of bad, but not that terrible. And then obviously with Wilbur Crest, it becomes very above rate. So has insane healing, Benison, Gilneas, Supplicant, Shiny Disenchantment, maybe more spells here and there, but that is basically infinite healing. We've all seen the red screenshots of people like having to deal like 60 damage to a Crest Haven to kill them. Like, that's ridiculous. But they also have really good value minions. So once again, Marwyn is probably the best 4-drop in the game besides Zirconia. And arguably, Marwyn is actually better than Zirconia because he gives you permanent value on his crest. So there is a small note where Marwyn is probably assumed to be nerfed because you have Devotee of Repose' crest nerfing him. So he's realistically supposed to be a 2/4, but that's giving a lot of credit to Devotee of Repose being on your board. So a 6 mana or a 4 mana 6/6 that gives you a game-breaking spell. I think this guy might be better than Zirconia. I think this is literally the most overpowered minion, permanent value on Evo. With Crest, you are guaranteed to get massive value. It gives you a Banish that can kill stuff like Lilanthem, which removes an entire deck from the meta. It gives you a massive minion that you can't even leave on board because if the Haven player can swing to your face for 6 damage, obviously they're going to swing to your face for 6 damage. It is crazy how overtuned this 4-drop monstrosity is. Obviously, it's kind of crazy going backwards and knowing that we didn't know that he was going to be this good in the past, but yeah. And then stuff like Shiny Enchantment, it's just, you know how I talked about OTKs and like big burst damage? It turns out that Haven actually has equal burst to Sword if you manage to set up stuff like Cup beforehand. So it's not even safe to be low HP versus Haven because they can set up one Shiny Enchantment 4 mana ahead of time, which isn't even that dangerous because they can pair it with Cup. They can pair it with, like Grimnir Super Evo. They can pair it with, just MARWYNN's AoE. So setting up Shiny Enchantment, unless they're very, very low or they're missing crests, is very safe for Crest Haven. And what happens is that if they set up 2 Shiny Enchantments, you're going to take 13 damage on 1 turn because they set one up the turn before. And then this is obviously a 3-card combo for if you want to pretend that MARWYNN is another card, more if you want to pretend that every crest is a card. Let's not give you, and we're not giving you guys that much leeway though. This is essentially a 3-card combo where you set up Chinese Enchantment, clear the board, and then the next turn is Cup into the second Chinese Enchantment, and then depending on how many crests you have, it goes from an 11 damage to 13 damage burst. That is basically Albert for crest, and that is over half your HP. So if you have 3 crests, which is probably pretty possible, like you have Grimnir, MARWYNN, Wilbert, those are your 3 permanent crests, you can still deal 11 damage from hand. And that's not even including the fact that you have Gilnelise as a spell to also poke. So that on turns like, turn 10 and beyond, you can play Gilnelise, and then you can deal 5 to your opponent. And then if you've, again, set up a Shiny Enchantment a turn before, that is 14 damage you can take in 1 turn from Crest Haven, assuming that the Gilnelise clears her board, because she is basically 7 damage to the board. So she clears 1 minion, her spell clears the minion left, and then they pop their Shiny Enchantment, you take 9, they end their turn, take another 5. Is literally better burst than Sword. That is insane. And then that's, again, not even including the fact that Crest Haven has the best long-term win con in the game because MARWYNN is a permanent crest. So even when they're top decking, if you and them are top decking, odds are you will lose the game because you are taking constant pressure from MARWYNN's crest over and over and over again. And that's, again, not even contemplating the fact that all their minions are really well statted or have really great effects, because Wilbert is, again, very notorious for being a fat minion, and he is beaten basically solely by Odin at this point. And then Jean is just essentially a board wipe, especially in this age with MARWYNN spells. So almost nothing survives a Jean AoE into MARWYNN Pain. There are some things that do, but those are some of the most egregious minions in the game if they can do that, which maybe is just like more, I think that's literally only like Crest Haven player boards or like Ward Haven player boards. So even Jean is just a disgusting board wipe, which again sets up for you, the enemy player, to take like 4 or 5 damage for free because of MARWYNN's crest. And then finally, we have Midrange Abyss, which once again, let's go through the list. Great healing, great healing, great healing, great healing. So 4 sources of pretty solid healing from Midrange Abyss, which makes it very hard to 2-turn kill them, which is again something that Storm Dragon and Puppet Portal and Midrange Abyss really want to do. They have insanely high value cards. So once again, a 4 mana 4/4 with great effects, a 5 mana 8/8 that can quickly become really massive with Shamnacha. You have Rune and Balnaric, which are again 15/15 for 7, and then when you have mode, even Storms for 5 or 8 if you have more Super Evos. Cerberus, we talked about earlier, just absolutely massive card. And then once you have mode, Gensetsu and Yuzuki is just not only wiping your enemy board, it is also healing you, it is also spawning a board for you. Gensetsu and Yuzuki with Shamnacha active does everything. The singular reason why Midrange Abyss can even be considered bad or not super top tier is purely because of the fact that Rune has Cosida's Climb combo, which ignores all of the stuff that Midrange Abyss built up to, and then Crest Haven, which is very similar to mode and concept, where you just have these massively high value endgame conditions that you fulfill by just playing the game normally. Like Crest Haven doesn't need to go out of its way to set up crests. You just play stuff like Supplicant, play that. MARWYNN, Evo. You have stuff like Congregative Repos. You just Evo that, start drawing again. Wilbert, you always want to Evo. Grimnir, like these are all cards that you are fine with playing on curve for the most part. Like Supplicant of Repose, a bit less so because obviously there are way better 3-drops in the game. But knowing that is essentially a pseudo Sage Light, like it's still very, very good, right? And then again with mode, you know, your 3-drop Devotee could be, it's like Fempolo, you deal 1 AoE or you make it 3/3 for 3 mana. That's pretty good. Supplicant of Entwining, very good body. Conqueror of Entwining, very good body. RMV, very good. Like everything is just slotting together. So obviously we can go about the Mode Abyss win cons. Mode Abyss, the main win con, is going to be getting their RMV and getting storm value from it, because once they have mode active, again, they can make the original RMV copy go straight to your face. And then they can also set up OTKs once they play 2 RMVs, save 1 of these Scream Diffusions and 2 Wings of Desires, and then play that in tandem with Cerberus, which obviously won't always one-shot you, but if you do the math, 2 RMVs is going to be 10 damage. Cerberus adds 2 to both of them, so that's 14 damage. And Cerberus herself summons Mimi, who is going to be 16 damage. So if you were to Super Evo Cerberus, you can gain 2 more damage through the Mimis, I think. Yeah, I think you can actually, yeah, because it'd be two minions, Cerberus, sack Mimi. Oh, I guess it'd be RNG because Coco's there to scuff it up. So you probably Super Evo something else, but you guys know what I mean. Like essentially, these are, you can set up a almost one-shot kill through RMV and Cerberus, and obviously you pressure really good 2-turn kills. Again, the reason why Mode Abyss is not tier 1 or not like tier 0 is because their OTK isn't really consistent at all. They just have insane value and insane pressure. And the way they usually win is that they run you out of cards, run you out of value. They force their really overstated minions to stay on the board for just 1 turn. And then Cerberus hits the ground, you take 10 in 1 turn, and then you die the next turn. So yeah, this video ended up being pretty yappy, but I just wanted to really connect why every single deck is in every single tier at the moment. And hopefully, if you actually listen to all my explanations, you can see what exactly makes these 4 crafts just significantly better than the other crafts below it. And that won't change. Like, you have to nerf so much because, again, nerfing Rune and Cresthaven doesn't even do much for the meta because Sword and Mode Abyss would just become even better. Like, Rune is only going to be beating a lot of Mode Abyss games because of Echo Sidus Climb combo. And if you remove Rune from the game, as it turns out, you just have to deal with Mode Abyss now forever and Cresthaven forever. And so obviously these tier 1 decks do have their weaknesses, like they aren't perfect decks, and that's why the game is quote unquote balanced. But hopefully with this you can see why this meta can be very frustrating for people, because these tier 1 decks literally just do everything. And then Rune and Haven specifically have these game plans where they just sit back and absorb all of your pressure, and then you blink and you're dead, which happens very, very often against these decks. So hopefully if you're wondering about why the decks are where they are, why certain meta aspects are so frustrating, this video explained a lot. And yeah, that'll be it. I hope you guys have a good day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.